Hello, my name is Mallory Jenna Robinson. Join me on A Hateful Homicide, a true crime podcast dedicated to telling the stories regarding the murders of transgender, gender non-binary, and gender diverse community members in the United States and abroad. This is A Hateful Homicide.
911, what's your emergency?
Yeah. A transgender woman has been shot and killed in North Baltimore. Alpha?
In the U.S., trans women of color have a life expectancy of just 35 years.
This happens on a daily. Another one of my friends got killed right up the street from here.
These cases are true. The victims are real, and their voices matter. This is A Hateful Homicide. The murder of Janice Roberts, the Sick Ripper of Connecticut. Wednesday, June 18th, 2003, New Britton, Connecticut. Warning, the following episode you're about to listen to will contain disturbing evidence of violence and mutilation, as well as evidence of misgendering. Listening discretion is advised.
A serial killer in Connecticut will be sentenced next week to 6 consecutive life sentences or 360 years behind bars. You may remember this scene, the remains of 7 people discovered behind a strip mall in New Britain. All were eventually linked to one man, William Devin Howell.
Now his case is being profiled in a new book. Troubleshooter Jill Konopka sat down with the author in a Troubleshooters exclusive. Jill, what did you learn?
Well, Kevin and Carrie Lee, for the first time, Ann Howard is sharing her chilling phone calls with serial killer Bill Howell. They, along with dozens of letters and prison visits, are the basis of her new book. And tonight, she explains why.
I want to first apologize to my victim's family for the grief and pain I have caused.
An apology from William Devin Howell, who confessed to killing 7 people, raping some of the victims in the back of his van.
I'm pleading guilty to spare the victim's families further pain and torment that would have been brought about by a lengthy trial.
Admissions from recorded collect calls between Howell in prison in Cheshire and true crime author Ann Howard.
He wanted it to be done. He just wanted to fess up and have this nightmare resolved.
At the end of the day, I feel that the house trade alone would have been enough to convict him.
From January to October 2003, 7 individuals in and around New Britain, Connecticut went missing. All of their bodies were subsequently found in close proximity to one another in a wooded lot behind a suburban strip mall.
Howard, an attorney, doesn't represent Howell.
I hope to delve into the question of good and evil.
She's currently writing a book.
It's not about trying to write this in any kind of a way that's salacious or inappropriate. I want to get into the mindset of what causes someone to do this and become a monster.
Howard first reached out to Howell in July of 2015, and their conversations haven't stopped.
He is willing to tell me everything that I want to know, and sometimes, frankly, it's almost too much for me to hear.
Much of it translating into copy for readers.
The monster stirred inside him. Most times he could tame it, keep it hidden, silence its screams. But tonight, the beast demanded release. I see him as a mentally, deeply troubled human being. And I write in the book that there are times when I felt compassion for him.
And sympathy for the victims. Anne is a mother too, with a daughter the same age as Howell's youngest victim.
This man had a sexual addiction, and he was trying at an early age to numb himself from very real psychological pain that he was going through.
Pain the victims' families will never escape. Years of trust led Howell to open up about his childhood, a drinking problem, and eventually his unsuspecting victims. And his reason for the killings remain unclear.
What he has admitted to me is that he has a strong disdain for drug-addicted prostitutes. He, in many ways, had the view that they were not as worthy as ordinary law-abiding citizens.
That I am guilty of the crimes I pleaded to. I did knowingly and willfully cause the death of Melanie Candellini. I did knowingly and willfully cause the death of Marilyn Gonzalez. I did knowingly and willfully cause the death of Jamie Withstand. I did knowingly and willfully cause the death of Nilsa Erin Cindy. I did knowingly and willfully cause the death of Mary Jane Menard. And I did knowingly and willfully cause the death of Diane Cusack and Joyvelyn Martinez.
Now those confessions are part of her book, named for the woods where the bodies were buried.
His garden, the true story of a serial killer.
As she writes, Howard is trying to keep the victims' families in mind.
Another family member wanted to know about the nature of how their family member was killed. And as they wondered about it, they dreamt about it, and I was able to tell them the details.
It's Wednesday, June 18th, 2003, in the city of New Britton, Connecticut. It would be the home where 44-year-old African-American transgender female Janice Roberts was residing. And on that Wednesday, she was last seen getting into William Devin Howell, a 33-year-old white cisgendered male's blue van at a Stop and Shop in Wethersfield, Connecticut. Just within 8 days of her disappearance, her family became suspicious when they couldn't get a hold of Janice. Witnesses recall seeing Roberts get into the van of William Devin Howell. Unfortunately, they didn't have an idea of who this guy was, and so at the time when Janice was finally reported missing on June 24th of 2003, they really didn't have much to go on. Unfortunately, when everything is revealed, what is uncovered is that William Devin Howell is also known as the Sick Ripper of Connecticut, one of the most prolific serial killers of Connecticut's history. It all began on New Year's Day of 2003. This is 3 years into the Y2K, known as the year of the 2000s, filled with pop, pagers, beepers, you name it. This was a decade of new beginnings. And that's exactly what 44-year-old transgender female Janice Roberts was looking forward to in 2003. Unfortunately, that was not the case for Melanie Ruth Camilli, a 29-year-old white cisgendered female. On that New Year's Day, she encountered William Devin Howell. She, a mother of two, had been in the city of Waterbury at the time, and she was seen talking to Howell and another cisgendered male. However, she disappeared and was never seen again. This began a series of homicidal acts and what will be known as serial killing by the hands of William Devin Howell. Why? Because when William didn't get his way sexually, he would then react in such a way that would cause these victims to lose their life, not just viciously, but brutally, by strangling, mutilating, and oftentimes sexually assaulting each and every one of his 7 victims. And unfortunately, that included 44-year-old transgendered female Janice Roberts. Janice, in this case, my audience, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. Oh my goodness, thank you for being here. Janice Roberts in 2003 was 44, and she was looking forward to this incredible life. She had worked as a survival sex worker along with 6 cisgendered females who are also other victims of William Devin Howell. He had this propensity, my audience, for wanting to get what he wanted when he wanted it. This sexual violence, this need to be angry and enraged when he didn't get things his way. And unfortunately, these 7 victims between January 1st of 2003 all the way down until October 30th of 2003 would encounter this man and would encounter such brutality that what he would do next with their bodies would be shocking. He takes their bodies to the Waterbury Mall, and he would place their bodies in this abandoned woods The woods itself is heavily filled with poison ivy, and so typically a lot of people don't even enter that area, which means that this was an incredible burial ground and treasure trove for William Devin Howell, often referring to this wooded area behind this mall as his garden, where he would go and rape, strangle, and bury these women, as well as mutilating some, including that of 44-year-old transgender female Janice Roberts. All of this included this sense of entitlement, this sense of viciousness that he just would not be able to contain. And each and every one of these victims, again, who are survival sex workers, and this was his assumption as well, as all of them were, survival sex workers, but at the same time were also mothers, daughters, granddaughters, sisters, and even just loved ones to all. William did not care. He wanted what he wanted when he wanted it. And that's exactly what he did when he encountered Janice Roberts on that Wednesday, June 18th, 2003. Again, around June 24th of that year, he was in his homicidal acts. Janice, unfortunately, was his second of 7 victims at this time, my audience. So between January and June, he had took a little hiatus. There's still, I guess, speculation that there could be other victims. And again, once he would go in and meet these women, he would pick them up at either a truck stop or a gas station or wherever. He would encounter them and he would put on this incredible charm and woo them and promise a good time. And each and every one of these women, cis and trans, would believe him, coming off as charming and easy to get along with. When they would get in the van, everything would change. William would describe himself as being very docile and polite, as you can hear in some of his audio in the beginning of the episode, sounding very pleasant and almost seemingly normal. But all of that could change. His voice could get very deeper, his eyes would get more pierced, and what would happen is that he would then begin to ball his fist, especially after he has asked each and every one of his victims to partake in sex. And when they said that they were either interested or no longer interested due to his aggressiveness, his propensity to want to be violent sexually as well, these things turned each and every one of these women off to the fact that they wanted to get out of his blue van and go home. And once William got them in that blue van, what he would do is pull out a knife, take them to the back of his blue van, force them to remove their clothing, sexually assault them, then strangling them. Unfortunately, two of the few victims that he did mutilate, again, included 44-year-old African-American transgender female Janice Roberts, as well as that of 20-year-old Joveline Martinez. Each and every one of these victims had a story. All of them were family members to loved ones. And William Devin Howell, who was from Hampton, Virginia, and had relocated to the Connecticut area around 2001, had begun to realize that his nature of wanting to be violent and harmful to women, there was no need to control it anymore. Once married and then divorced by the latter part of 2002, William Devin Howell had the ability to begin his killing spree. And unfortunately, that would begin just after New Year's Day in 2003 with that of 29-year-old cisgendered female Melanie Ruth Camillini. She was last seen, the mother of 2, leaving from a strip mall in Seymour, as well as the Waterbury, Connecticut area. The thing about each and every one of these victims, as I prepare to go through them, is that I want you to understand that their bodies were not discovered, recovered, and exposed until 12 years later after their hateful homicides. This would all begin around the summer of 2015, June to be exactly. A passerby needed to take a bio break, a restroom break, and decided to get out at the shopping mall and go into the woods. Why didn't the passerby go into one of the restrooms at the shopping mall? That is unclear. But when he went back there and discovered skeletal remains, he immediately notified the police. Coming out scratching a little bit due to the heavy wooded area being filled with poison ivy, he admitted that he was deeply disturbed by this. the New Britton, Connecticut detectives, that of John Pierce and Sarah Ferguson, all came out to the area guarded to assure that they didn't contract poison ivy, entered the woods, and began to uncover, slowly but surely, these badly decomposed bodies of 7 victims. And what was revealed through each and every one of their autopsies, as well as through their forensics reports, is that each and every one of these victims had been sexually assaulted. Some of the victims, especially Jorveline Martinez, had specifically had semen left inside of her, as well as that of Nilsa Arezamendi. So both of these victims who had semen inside of them, all was connected to William Devin Howell. When he was brought in due to genetic, forensic, and phenotypic testing, so what these investigators did, because this was considered a cold case from 2003 to 2015, is that they began to do genetic tracing, my audience. They didn't have an idea of who this profile belonged to because William Devin Howell didn't really have much of a violent past on record. He did have some domestic violence issues with his ex-wife, which has resulted in their divorce in the latter part of 2002. But in terms of a homicidal or any type of other acts against women, that had not been documented. So his DNA had not been taken. But what they were able to do during this genetic tracing, as this was very prevalent for the Golden Gate State Killer and other serial killers who had gotten away for so long with their heinous crimes, is that they were able to go ahead and take that DNA sample and then begin to trace it back to different relatives who would be related to then identified as William Devin Howell. At the time, in 2015, when he was arrested for the hateful homicides of his 7 victims, especially that of Janice Roberts, he was then 44. William Devin Howell at this point had remarried, had began to become a father to 2 young sons, and his family was completely shocked at the fact that for 12 years that he had been keeping this deep, dark secret of murder. As we continue to go through this case, my audience, I want to give you a victimology of each and every one of the victims, these roses, as he would quote them in his garden. Of course, we have Melanie Ruth Camellini, 29-year-old white cisgendered female. Our second victim is 44-year-old African-American transgendered female Janice Roberts. Then we go into Diane Cusack. This is a 55-year-old cisgendered white female. She was last seen around June 30th of 2003, and what happened is that she had a dispute with her landlord tenant, and she disappeared. So initially her landlord was under suspicion, and he later admitted that yes, him and Diane did not get along, but he was not involved. And when he underwent a polygraph, he was cleared. However, going to July 31st of 2003, Nilsa Arezamendi, a Middle Eastern cisgendered female, had encountered William Devin Howell as well. And because she had been been related and in relationships with a convicted drug dealer, they thought initially that her disappearance was connected into the drug industry. She too was living in a motel along the Wethersfield, Connecticut area and disappeared around 2:30 a.m. on July 25th of 2003. Unfortunately, Arezamendi would not be seen again. Then we fast forward until August of 2003, where then William Devin Howell would encounter Marilyn Gonzalez, a 26-year-old cisgendered Latina female, mother of 2. She was last seen leaving her home in Waterbury, near the West Farm Shopping Mall in Farmington, Connecticut, and unfortunately was never seen again. Then we shift gears into the month of October, that of October 10th, 2003. Jorveline, also known as Joy Martinez, a 23-year-old cisgendered Latina female, had not been reported missing until March of 2004. Suspicion arose when she did not show up for her 24th birthday. Witnesses recall seeing Joy last spotted in her hometown of East Hartford, Connecticut, where she lived with her mother, Rosa. She was in high school, she had been a track star at the time of her disappearance, and unfortunately was employed in survival sex work. William Devin Howell encountered her and murdered her. His last victim which would be that on October 30th, 2003, was that of 40-year-old cisgendered white female, Mary Jane Menard. She was a 40-year-old substance abuse counselor, again from Waterbury, Connecticut, and she went missing around the New Britain area on that October 30th, 2003. The remains of some of the victims began to surface, not initially all at one point because he had buried them throughout the backwoods, but what they continued to do was once they discovered that first skeletal remains, the New Britton Detectives Sean Pierce and Sarah Ferguson wanted to make sure that they were doing deeper investigations. Because of where the body, that of Joveline Martinez, was uncovered, they realized and suspected there may be more victims because of the fact that in 1995 that there had been another serial killer who had stored bodies back here. Detective Pierce and Ferguson had the idea that maybe, just maybe, that Miss Martinez was not the only victim. And as they uncovered, they would pull back this layer of betrayal, deceit, sex, violence, and murder, all by the hands of then 33-year-old cisgendered white male, William Devin Howell. I want us to shift gears and talk a little bit more about Janice Roberts. Born March 2nd, 1959 in Waterbury, Connecticut. She was an incredibly vibrant woman. She was loved by her mother and her father. She was loved by her sister and her brother and family members. And though that there was still this kind of tug of war with her gender identity in terms of how her family accepted and acknowledged her and affirmed her, Janice was determined to be in her truth. And in the year of 2003, she was living her best life. She was working as a survival sex worker, determined to make her coin. We have to recall, my audience, as we have in now the third season, is that so many times because our community members of the trans experience are feeling discriminated against, are experiencing discrimination and stigma, oftentimes we will turn to survival sex work. And Janice Roberts, a black trans woman in 2003 with no access to healthcare, employment, education, or transportation, did just that. And unfortunately, William Devin Howell, who had this propensity of targeting sex workers, women that he felt that were vulnerable and would unlikely be missed, would then go put on his charm, get them into his van, and then begin to murder them. Why? Because they said no. William Devin Howell is an interesting character, currently serving a 15-year prison sentence for manslaughter. Around November 8th of 2017, after the rest of the bodies from 2 years from that June of 2015 until that November, as bodies were continuing to be uncovered and he was beginning to confess as he had this whole guilty conscience, his new wife and his young sons were encouraging him to make peace with God, his mother, all of these individuals were really hoping for him to get his life together and make amends and atone for his heinous actions and his hateful homicides of each and every one of these victims. As a result of his confessions, of course, he was sentenced to 15 years to life for manslaughter, but then he also received a life sentence in Connecticut, which is essentially going to be the rest of his life since he's in his 40s, for the hateful homicides of the other 6 victims. The interesting thing about this case is that he is charged with 6 counts of murder and 1 count of first-degree manslaughter. And guess which case was that of first-degree manslaughter? You got it, that of Janice Roberts. The interesting part about Janice's case is that William, when, questioning, because as they uncovered the skeletal remains, they were able to, do a bone angle, which, hip angle, which gives you this sense of, gives you an anatomical assumption of someone's assigned sex at birth. So when they were able to uncover Janice Roberts' skeletal remains, 12 years later after her hateful homicide, 12 years later after she had been reported missing, 12 years later after each and every one of these victims' families wondered what happened to their loved ones, he would admit that when he picked up Janice on that Wednesday afternoon, they got into his blue van and they went over to the Waterbury Mall. Once they pulled over there, they got into his blue van, in the back of his blue van, and he wanted to have sex. Janice, according to him, had not disclosed her gender identity. And when he discovered her gender identity, he began to strangle her. And if that wasn't enough, because he was already enraged and sexually attracted to her, he then sodomized Roberts and then would mutilate her by assaulting her anatomy. Then taking her body out by that night and placing it in the woods alongside that of Melanie Ruth Camillini. She, along with the rest, would be there, and no one had an idea of what happened. And again, authorities did not think to look behind the wooded area in the mall because of the fact that there had not been any evidence of serial killing violence, or there had been no connecting each and every one of these victims, who were all different ages, who were all different ethnicities and races, different gender identities. They had no reason to initially, John Pierce, Detective John Pierce and Detective Sarah Ferguson, had no reason to put these cases together until they had the wherewithal to realize that maybe that there was more than one victim in this woods. So by the time that they had uncovered that of Janice Roberts' remains and uncovered that she had been assigned male at birth, they knew that there was more to this case than that. And once they were able to get that DNA and that genetic tracing profile of William Devin Howell and ask him about each and every one of these victims as they began to do DNA testing and uncover the identities of each and every one of these victims, as it had been, over a decade since their bodies had been intact, they were able to identify most of the victims, except the seventh victim, which took several more years. So at the time when they finally identified William Devin Howell through DNA, through genetic tracing and phenotypic profiling is taking physical traits from genetic ancestors and creating an almost kind of composite sketch of what the suspect would look like. And they were able to really get an idea of what this what this perpetrator looked like. They had an idea that he was a white male from Euro ancestry, that he had blondish hair, he had brownish blue eyes, and those were pretty much the characteristics. And then once they were able to get the DNA and compare it to that of his genetic ancestors and relatives, they were then able to narrow in on William Devin Howell. Once he was brought in June of 2015, he immediately confessed. Feeling the walls closing in, he always said that he felt that this time was going to come, and he knew that he was going to have to answer and pay for his crimes. And to William Devin Howell's credit, quote unquote, once confronted and confessed, he actually admitted to committing the hateful homicides of each and every one of these 7 victims. Again, 6 identifying as cisgendered females and 1 identifying as a transgendered female. All different ethnicity, races, and ages. Some were mothers, grandmothers, as well as daughters. And so, unfortunately, when asked why did he commit the hateful homicide of Janice Roberts on that June 18th of 2003, he said that, again, he had no idea that Janice was trans, and when he found out, he reacted, committed the hateful homicide, and discarded her body behind the Waterbury Mall. Well, they wanted to know the remaining identities of the other victims, which he gladly did. He confessed, pointed out what happened, and all of this came into place over a 12-year investigation span, as well as an additional 2-year investigation into the identity of the 7th victim. It wouldn't be until June of 2017 when then Mary Jane Menard's remains would be uncovered, and she would also be identified. The other victims had, pretty much had some records and things of that nature, so they were able to get a lot of their DNA and match it to arrest records and other samples that they had collected from the victims over the years. To give you an idea of New Britton, Connecticut, New Britton, Connecticut is a town of a population of 50,000, and it's the home of each and every one of these women. Some of them came from other places to build a life here. Some lived in hotels, some lived with family, but nonetheless, they were trying to do the best that they could with the life that they had. And William Devin Howell, who was angry over the fact that his ex-wife had left him due to his sexual aggression, his need to be violent during sex, and just wanted to be free of that toxicity, he began to take out his rage on any woman that would then continue to refuse him sex. The author, Ann Howard, began to investigate and into the hateful homicides that William Devin Howell committed. She's writing a book called In His Garden, surrounding the hateful homicides that William Devin Howell committed between January and October of 2003. She stated that some of the information was so disturbing, as she's a mother of her own, was very overwhelming, and it was hard to process and hear. But nonetheless, she knew that this was important to make sure that each and every one of the victims had a voice. And because this case had garnered so much attention between 2015 to present, other networks such as and shows such as True Crime Watch Daily and other mainstream media platforms covered this case. And when William Devin Howell finally was ready to sit down and confess to the media as to what he did, he definitely had a story to tell. And this story would include a lot of violence, anger, aggression, this need to be aggressive, this need to forcefully insert himself into these females vaginally or anally, depending on his pleasure at the time, having no remorse or consensus for their needs, for their pleas to get back home to their families and their children. That all went out the door. And what's interesting is, my audience, is that William Devin Howell, though he has appeared to be remorseful and atoned for his monstrous and heinous acts, there was still this disconnect to him taking really true accountability for the fact that he murdered and committed the hateful homicides of these 7 victims. Ann Howard asked him, William, if you were, quote unquote, so concerned about each and every one of these victims, why didn't you anonymously alert the authorities of where the bodies were? Why did it take 12 years later for an anonymous passerby who was taking a bio break, a restroom break, to go out into the woods, uncover 1 skeletal remains, leading detectives to then uncover 6 more? William Devin Howell would say this.
I committed monstrous and heinous crimes, but my true character isn't the monstrous and heinous person.
William Devin Howell admits to ending the lives of 7 people in his murder-mobile and stashing their mutilated bodies behind a busy strip mall. Now, in his first national TV interview, we're talking to the man being called Connecticut's most prolific serial killer.
Good morning, William. How are you? This is Nurse and I with Crime Watch Daily.
I'm alright, how are you?
I know you were reluctant to talk to the media at first. What changed your mind?
Well, I'm still not real excited to talk to y'all, and I'd rather not be doing it at all, but I did this as a favor to Ann.
Regardless of his reasons for talking, it was an opportunity I wasn't going to squander, getting inside the mind of the man who once called himself the Sick Ripper.
Everybody wants to know why, and the truth is, I don't know why, you know what I mean? I was raised by a good family and a good home. I was never abused. I was never molested. I didn't kill animals when I was a little kid or anything like that. So I just don't fit the mold at all that everybody tries to put serial killers in. You know what I mean? So why I grew up to commit these crimes, I have no idea. Other than the only thing I can say is for my own selfish reasons.
So then, where did it all go wrong? How did Hal go from being happy kid to killer?
I started screwing up my life.
How did you start screwing up your life?
Well, through drinking, and I served half in the 90s in jail or prison in Virginia, and it was all for driving a car without a license, and that instilled a lot of bitterness in me, you know what I mean?
You were angry.
Yeah, I was angry inside.
And that's when he says the sick thoughts started creeping in.
It was something that I had fantasized about for a few years.
So you began fantasizing about killing people in Virginia in the 90s.
I didn't start, the fantasy wasn't about killing somebody. I killed them to try to cover up my crime. The fantasy was about just raping them.
What happened? What made you cross the line?
I don't know, I just decided to act on my impulses. You know, I'd been out drinking a little bit, and I was pissed off at my girlfriend at the time, and I don't know, just something made me say, well, tonight I'm gonna cross the line, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna make my fantasy come true.
And once he crossed that line, he says horror became habit.
It's not like it was a beast that was driving me to commit these crimes. This may make me even more sinister, but it was something that I chose to do. I didn't have something driving me that I couldn't control, you know what I mean, or anything like that. And I chose to do what I did, and I just chose not to care.
But he says that was then, and that today he does feel remorse for what he's done, for the pain he's brought to his victims' loved ones.
I would hear him sobbing in the courtroom, and it just tore me apart.
You're so concerned about the victim families now. You have a heart, as you should, for the victims' families, their feelings, and empathy now. Why do you think about the family members of the people who you killed on those nights and days?
I have no excuse. What can I say? I was selfish. You know, I try and be a good person. I try and, you know, live my life with a direct integrity, and then I went and committed crimes that were the total opposite of how I try and live and conduct myself. I am very remorseful for my actions, and if I could go back and take it all back, I would. If I could give my life to bring theirs back, I would.
I was at Howell's sentencing just a few weeks before and caught up with a family friend of Mary Jane Menard to ask what he thought of Howell's contrition.
Howell stood up and he addressed the victims' families.
It sounded like he meant what he said, but like apologizing sincerely about them, but what he did was like very bad. I couldn't imagine like going through something like that.
Do you feel sympathy for him?
No, not really. I wanted to choke him out, actually.
That day when we were in court, why did you plead guilty?
Because I'm guilty. I didn't want to put the families through it. I felt like if I went to trial, I would have been found guilty anyway, so why put the families through it, and why put the taxpayers through it?
In fact, he says if he had his way, he would have gotten a lot worse than the 360-year sentence he received.
I feel like the just sentence would have been the death penalty.
So you would rather have gotten lethal injection versus life in prison? You want to die?
I would rather have the lethal injection when I committed the crime. That was the sentence I expected to serve.
But Howell also admits that if he hadn't been caught, his killing spree very well may have continued.
Probably. There would have probably been more victims.
So then, did Howell have genuine remorse, or was it just that he'd been caught? I decided to ask him some specifics about his victims, and that's when the tone of our conversation suddenly shifted.
Do you remember the names of any of your victims?
I know who they all are. I'm not going to get into that.
But the families deserve to know, so I pushed on.
So when you hear the name Mary Jane Menard, do you remember the person who it was that night?
I'm really tired of talking about this. I don't like talking about it at all.
He doesn't like talking about it at all, my audience. But he did open up more to his new BFF, author of his true crime and autobiography, In His Garden. When she was doing an interview, my audience, she asked him, "Why did you kill them, Bill?" quote unquote. And he says, "It wasn't about killing Anne. It was about raping. The prosecutors don't know this, but I didn't just rape 3 of them. They based that on what ADA Jonathan Mills had told them. How would they know that I had raped just 3? At the time, the bodies were nothing but bones when they dug them up. I raped all of them except Danny Risnan, because he was a man. Yeah, I picked him up in New Britain after leaving the Cadillac Ranch in Southington. He was wearing a short miniskirt and high heels, and he had long, shiny black hair. I thought he was a woman. I drove to the nearby grocery store parking lot for a $20 blowjob. When I put my hand on his head and pulled off the wig he was wearing, I discovered he was a guy, and I killed him right off." Anne asked, "How did you kill him, Bill?" He said, "I punched him a couple of times, and then I strangled him, mutilated him as well." Of course, after this was done in 2016 when he spoke to Ann. He would then go back and change that he had sexually assaulted all of his victims by then sodomizing Janice Roberts. What's sad about this case, my audience, is that when you really think about the violence here that happened, the brutality that happened to each and every one of these women who were just living their lives, who were just trying to make a quick coin, who was just trying to get back home to their loved ones, had no idea that this guy was a serial killer. As you could hear in his voice, it was very meek and, not really this tone until the interviewer really start getting into the specifics. And you could almost see this shift in him, right, where he didn't want to talk about it. And that is pretty much how, and also the author Ann K. Howard would describe how William would be. He would be very kind, very easy to converse with for a while, and then all of a sudden, in his case, when he would want sex and they would decline, then he would react angrily, get very short with them, and before they knew it, they would be murdered and stored in his garden behind a New Britton, Connecticut shopping mall. Their bodies land there for over 12 years. My audience, this case, it really just grabs at your heart when you think of this sick ripper of Connecticut, William Devin Howell. The sick ripper part, right, because of the mutilation, the sexual assault, the strangulation, the sodomy, all of these acts of violence that he would do to make sure that his victims were in his control. As he stated, it was not about the murder, it was about the rape. But then at the same time, he still committed the murders. Why? As you heard, he had issues at home from his ex-wife to then the girlfriend that he was with at the time, as well as just really having anger towards women. This case is one of those that it pulled at my heartstrings because, in 2003, Janice Roberts, the only trans woman in this case who, again, was just trying to do what she needs to do, like each and every one of the other cisgendered females, were all just trying to, live their best lives, and unfortunately encountered someone who was hateful, angry, bitter, and not happy with his life. And, as we prepare to get ready to conclude this case in just a moment, I want to take a moment and give you an idea into the arrest of William Devin Howell.
That area, that's a fair-sized piece of property out there.
First at 5, a major break. A suspected serial killer's decade-old crime spree comes to a head. Police reveal more victims were discovered, but they have their suspect. Good evening. The crimes began a dozen years ago and centered around a wooded area near West Farms Mall in New Britain.
It is that area where police have just revealed the remains of at least 4 additional victims have been discovered. In all, at least 7 women are believed to have been killed at the hands of the same man, and tonight he is in police custody. Let's head straight out to Fox Connecticut's John Charlton, who's live at police headquarters with the late-breaking details. John?
Well, Katie and Brent, police had suspected all along that there were more bodies behind that strip mall in New Britain. And today, here at the police department, they made that announcement that they uncovered 4 more victims, 3 of them unidentified, 1 identified. They also have a suspect, but that suspect has not been identified.
The remains recovered were skeletal in nature and consistent with having been at this location for at least 10 years.
3 weeks of digging, and the Greater New Britain Serial Killer Task Force unearthed even more horror behind a New Britain strip mall off Route 9 near Corbin's Corner.
We basically took that area of probably over an acre down in grade by about 3 feet.
4 more sets of bones from 4 different people, making a total of 7 victims. This after years of not finding anything since 2007, when police dug up the remains of Mary J. Menard, Diane Cusack, and Joyvaline Martinez. Monday, another victim identified.
Melanie Ruth Camellini. This is a picture of Melanie. Melanie was born May 11th, 1973, and is from Seymour, Connecticut. Melanie Camellini was last seen in Waterbury, Connecticut in January 2003. Melanie is the mother of 2 children. Today is Melanie's birthday.
How detectives knew where to look, authorities wouldn't say. However, they did say an FBI cadaver-sniffing dog named Missy zeroed in on specific spots. On top of all that, the chief state's attorney, Kevin Kane, admitted they have a suspect, but he wouldn't name him or where he is.
I'm going to say strongly that there is no reason to be concerned from this suspect at this time, and that's all we can say.
We know that there are at least 7 individuals there. They were killed at separate times. The FBI has a definition of what a serial killer is that would fit the definition.
This serial killer, this sick ripper of Connecticut, came in from Virginia and committed these hateful homicides from January 1st until October 30th of 2003, leaving a wake of 7 bodies, those of daughters, mothers, grandmothers, and sisters. And to our specific victim in this case, that of 44-year-old African-American transgender female, Janice Roberts, we remember you, love bug. Born March 2nd, 1959, and resting on since June 18th, 2003. Again, we remember you. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, forever, and always. Thank you all so much, my audience, for tuning in to this episode of A Hateful Homicide. My name is Mallory Jenna Robinson, your host. You can follow us on Instagram at A Hateful Homicide. You can follow me at MalloryJenna90. Check out our website at ahatefulhomicide.net. You can listen to us on Apple and Spotify podcasts as well as Google Podcasts. Please, please, please continue to support and raise awareness by using the hashtags A Hateful Homicide, say their names, Suspenseful Saturdays, Trans Awareness, True Crime Podcast. Thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And stay tuned for next week at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Saturday to listen to the next episode of A Hateful Homicide. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.